Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you in the other episodes on my channel Above the Horizon. My name is Gabriela Mastafiak, and today I have a pleasure to speak to Ian Garner, the PhD, the specialist in Russian propaganda, contemporary Russia as well, the author of the book published in Polish by Prześwity Publishing House, the Z Generation in Polish. Its title is Za Putina. Good afternoon, Mr. Garner. I'm happy to have you today.
Hi. Dzień dobry. Thanks for having me.
Dzień dobry. And let me start with the first question. And I think it would be a pretty obvious one because we met today to talk about the recent attack that happened in Moscow. And we are going to discuss a bit the pattern, the template of the Russian propaganda that has been used and has been adjusted to this event. So let me elaborate a bit and emphasize on what has happened. More than 130 people has been killed in the Crocus City Mall during the concert. That was a concert hall, and people gathered there, encountered by the attackers who were identified as the Tajikistan citizens, the people recruited by the ISIS Khorasan province organization. And that was very quick when we get to know what exactly has happened, especially according to the Kremlin and the Russian establishment. So I would like to ask you about what have you thought about the whole situation when you have seen the communication issued by the Russian establishment, by the Russian press services, by the Russian media. Was it any familiar to you when it comes to other events that took place in Russia or Russian activity in the world, for example?
So it was in many ways very, very familiar, all too familiar. And yet there were some differences that I think we can unpick and explore a little bit, because it tells us a little bit more about how the state might deal with this particular attack. And it might tell us a little bit more, potentially, although we have to do some guesswork, about whether the state knew about the attack in advance. And so the most fundamental part of this is that you note that, well, they found the culprits very quickly and decided who was to blame very quickly. And the answer is, yeah, sure they did. From the perspective of a Western observer, where we might expect the judicial process, the investigating process might take days, weeks, months, potentially even years, but it seems like from the Russian state's perspective, justice is already being done. They've found the guys who did it. They've decided they were to blame. They have tortured them very graphically, wheeled them out into courthouses, said, these were our guys. They're getting charged. And we know what happens in the Russian court system. If you are charged, you are almost certainly found guilty. And so these guys are going to go to jail, or potentially there is even talk of bringing back the death penalty for these figures. And I have no idea whether that might happen or not. It's too soon to say. However, there are some complications. We know that Russia usually will pin the blame on suspects pretty quickly. So, for example, I can think back to the car bombing that killed Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, was that summer 2022 or 23? I think 22, but I'm already losing track of time in a war that seems to have been tracking
I
on
think it was at the very beginning of 2023, because it was somewhere at the beginning of the year. But yeah, we both know, and I think our
Anyway,
yes,
it was recently, right?
Mhm.
And within a few hours, the state media had announced who was to blame, claimed it was, I believe, a Ukrainian on an Estonian passport. They created a story. But what is different about this particular attack is that the mass media in Russia actually did not respond particularly quickly. So what we first saw is the idea that there were Islamic terrorists to blame emerging on social media, and that was pretty quickly happened and seemingly spontaneously because of the look, the ethnicity of the people who were conducting the attack. Then we saw the idea floated that actually, maybe it was Ukraine to blame. Don't believe what you see. And that came, and BBC Verify have done a wonderful job on tracking how this story emerged. That came from some basically pretty peripheral Russian bloggers, not state operatives, not the mass media. It was within an hour or so of the attack. Only a couple of hours later did the state media, one of the big tabloids over in Russia, pick up this idea, but they didn't state that it was true. They quoted a so-called military expert who said, well, maybe it might be true. And then we saw Dmitry Medvedev chip in and say, again, not that this is true, but that if Ukraine has some responsibility, then they will be punished. So there is still lots of uncertainty on that first evening about what actually happened. It's only the next day that the state media really went all in on the narrative that it wasn't really ISIS, because behind ISIS, behind these people, Ukraine is pulling the strings. And who is pulling Ukraine's strings? It's Washington, it's NATO, it's the collective West. And if you believe the front page of the newspaper Argumenty Fakty that was published yesterday, I don't know if you saw this, Gabriela, it was Joe Biden, it was Rishi Sunak, it was Olaf Scholz, it was even Boris Johnson, who is, he's not in any position of power nowadays.
Mossad, MI6, CIA, all of the secret services that were listed by Russian propaganda that have to be involved into pulling the strings of the Ukraine or being behind those attacks. So Russian had a wide variety of possibilities on the table presented to the audience.
But it wasn't a wide variety of possibilities in a way that it has been in the past. So look, for example, do you remember the MH17 bombing it was around about a decade ago now, when that passenger jet was shot down over eastern Ukraine? When you look at the response to that in the days and hours after the event, of the news of the event broke, the state media came up with lots of different explanations. It was Ukraine who did it. It was a Ukrainian jet. It was a Ukrainian missile that did it. Maybe it was separatists, but if it was separatists, then it didn't, it had nothing to do with us, nothing to do with Moscow. And so these are actually quite different realities. You saw it again with Bucha. When news of Bucha broke, there were lots of different explanations. It was really the Ukrainians that did it. It was a few rotten apples. None of it's real. It's all faked. It's all staged. This time we haven't seen that. We've really seen them go with this story that it was really Ukraine and the West, all of whom are working in tandem. And one thing that they haven't done with this story is presented any evidence. And usually what the Russian state will do is either present real evidence but skew it so that it seems to show something that it doesn't, or they'll just make stuff up, right? They're fake images. We've also, do you remember in the first few months of the war, we used to get those ridiculous stories of the Russians seizing a house with supposed Ukrainian spies, and they would uncover images of Stepan Bandera and Nazi flags and copies of Mein Kampf and all this stuff, clearly faked. But this time they haven't bothered to do any of that. It's simply this assertion. It must have been Ukraine because, to quote Putin from his speech, who really benefits from this? It must be Ukraine. It can't be anybody else.
I was very interested when I have seen the first reactions by the Russian media, by the Russian propaganda, because by the Western observers, we usually do take a look at the Russia Today, because there is a chief editor, Margarita Simonian, who is called as the head of the propaganda in Russia. So what does she say? This is being treated as an official statement of the Kremlin, as She is being, pulled by the strings directly from Kremlin. But at the first glance, there wasn't any certainty between the Russian commenters. There were very different versions of what has happened. Like, as mentioned by you, Dmitry Medvedev, he said, if it's Ukraine, they need to be destroyed, but we are still not assured. Further on, we had to observe the very different versions, like maybe there were the Islamic terrorists, maybe there were any other groups that may have been involved in this attack. So it took like a few hours for Russian governments to establish the one version that is directed into Ukraine. And experts just bring to our attention the fact that it's just very useful for the Russian propaganda to blame Ukraine, even though they are 100% assured that the source of this terrorist attack is totally somewhere else. So do you think so as well, that they have just calculated what is the most beneficial for them at the very particular moment, and they just going to blame officially Ukraine? But if we observe the reaction of Russia, for example, any bombings, maybe in Syria or in the Middle East, we are going to get to know the real source of those perpetrators' motivations.
So I mean, obviously, the line that it's Ukraine to blame is just 100% bullshit, if you don't mind me swearing. But it's garbage. It doesn't make
No
any
worries.
sense. But look, the Russian state will always take an event like this and produce its own version of reality. That's what the propaganda is for. And that is what is going to drive Russian policy and Russian foreign policy, and in particular, Russian military policy as a result. Sure, they'll use this to justify a war against Ukraine or violence against Ukrainians, but why don't they take the problem seriously? Well, the answer is simply and quite unpleasantly, the state doesn't really care if 130 Russians die. Look at its conduct in Ukraine, where tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, we're not quite sure, of Russians have died. They wage war in a way that is violent and foolish and essentially draws its tactics from 1945, not 2024. And so they will use an event like this, construct a narrative, construct a fairy tale around it, and say, rather than look at the way in which we failed over the last 24 years to actually resolve the very problem that was the first problem that Putin promised to deal with when he became prime minister in 1999, which was terrorist attacks by Islamists on Moscow, they will instead say, the world is against us. Those problems are intractable, and the only way you can solve it is by trusting us and following us and doubling down. And I think the Russian public probably will experience this rally round the flag effect. You see it almost universally in any country, no matter how bizarre it is, that the response to incidents like this is to trust the state, trust the government, and we will see an increase in patriotic and xenophobic feeling and sentiment around it.
Is it going to work exactly? Because this is very interesting about recipients of those messages from Kremlin, because we obviously know that they just have been trying to blame Ukraine at any means, so they just calculated, and that was the most beneficial. But when we just take a look at the Russian audience and the people who are being attacked, with this information all over again, is it like a tailored for the Russian people mainly to gather them around the newly elected president, Vladimir Putin, who just want to mobilize people to join the army, for example, to conduct the new mobilization across the country. So, in other words, are Russians going to believe the message that has been sent?
Well, they may not believe. Like, if you watch what Margarita Simonyan said on Solovyov's evening chat show, well, maybe not chat show because more shouting than chatting, a couple of nights ago, she was, talking about don't believe anything. It's definitely Ukraine. It's definitely not ISIS. They may not believe exactly 100% that version of reality. But what we will find with this, as was the case with MH17, as was the case with Bucha, as was the case with numerous other events, Russians will believe parts of it. This is how the propaganda functions. The Russian propaganda apparatus just blasts at maximum volume, millions of times, these extreme messages, knowing that ordinary people will pick up a chunk of it. Maybe just a phrase. They will twist the story a little bit and then go repeat it to their friend, whether online, whether in person. And it creates this kind of what's called horizontal propaganda. If you're really interested, the French thinker Jacques Ellul has this seminal work about propaganda and written in the 1960s. If you want to read one book about propaganda, go read Jacques Ellul. It's very good. This is horizontal propaganda. Right. And it is the most powerful form of propaganda. It is when your peers, your parents, your friends, your family are telling you a particular version of reality. And so people may not consciously believe everything they're hearing, but they will take parts of it. And it creates this kind of there's no smoke without fire response. And we know that Russians speak in these terms. They speak a language of Putinism. And so sometimes they'll say, no, I don't believe the state. And yet when you actually look at the ways that they discuss their reality and their identity, it actually aligns more closely with the state's version than they might anticipate.
Yeah, we also observed this type of messaging to the Russian recipients after the death of Alexei Navalny at the very, very beginning of the year when he has died in far north of Russia, being detained there in the camp. So that was also pretty similar to the response to the last attack, because it took like a few hours to Russian government to issue a communication. He died because of a heart attack. He died just right after going out and having a walk. He just fell down and died. But after that, we were able to discover, because of the independent observers, that he was beaten, tortured by the guards in the camp, in the colony. So that was the main reason of his death. But I'm curious whether the Russians seek the truth, like a very typical Russian citizen, and someone who just hears about very similar stories. In fact, all the time, anything happens, anything, let's say, disturbing to the Russian public opinion, they hear very similar communication about it. So is it not suspected for them? They do not just feel like it happens very similarly all over and over again, and why should we trust those communication?
Contrary to some claims made in the West, there are lots of Russians who bitterly oppose the war, bitterly oppose Putin, and don't believe anything that comes from the state media. Right? Let's make that clear. So there are those people, and those are the people who are reading the BBC Russian service, who are listening to Radio Free Europe, who might well be listening to podcasts like this. So if that's you, then hello. But those people are not in the majority. The majority of Russians we know, quite a large percentage of them, will say, I don't trust everything that comes from the state media. But where do they turn for their information? Well, they turn to social media. And guess who is really, this sounds like I'm kind of going into a crazy conspiracy theory of my own, but who is really pulling the strings in the Russian language social media environment on VK, on Odnoklassniki, on Telegram, even on TikTok? where people are getting the news. The Russian state is involved in all of these places. It is creating fake realities everywhere you look. And Russians often have the impression of choice in information. You feel like you're talking to somebody more moderate, but implicitly between the lines, they are taking your part, though they are following the state's propaganda lines. And just this morning, for example, I've been writing an academic paper about how ordinary users on VK begin to speak the language of the state about these sort of crazy historical myths and lies about, the stuff that Putin was saying to Tucker Carlson. And lots of users, probably without realizing it, are just picking up little bits and pieces of that language verbatim from the state because they've seen it so much, they've heard it so much, they're surrounded by people using it, and so that becomes their version of reality. Objective reality and information, social media realities have become completely unmoored. In Russia, yes. Abroad too, we are all living in that same sort of phenomenon, but in Russia, the information environment is much more controlled and closed off than our information environments.
Yeah, social media, the internet, the connections between people created a great opportunity for the Russian propaganda to spread, to infect people in the West. Because even though we do have a choice to watch Russian state media, because there are mostly TV channels, and we mostly know about those people that they are attached to the Kremlin directly. But when it comes to social media, it's not that easy, as you said. And I'm curious how far this social media, the internet related propaganda went on the West. Do you observe any increase in the recent years, for example, after the attack on the Ukraine, or the activity of those Russian influencers, of course, hidden influencers that they are not officially announced, but we do see the people that maybe covering at the very beginning and just represent totally different interests, but at the one moment they just change their narration parts and they start spreading totally different news. So how far has it gone in the Western minds to be infected by the Russian version of reality?
The difficult fact to confront for us is that this has gone very far indeed. Russia conceives of the war against Ukraine as part of a much bigger war against the West, a war that is supposedly going to bring in this multipolar world order, that is going to make Russia a great imperial power again, that is going to reduce US influence. And what it really means by US influence is NATO, UK, Canada, Australia, Poland, you name it. And part of that bigger war is the use of hybrid warfare strategies, in particular information warfare strategies. And Russian military doctrine explicitly describes the use of disinformation and information campaigns as part of military strategy, a military strategy that is designed to effect regime change and chaos in the West. Now, when you look, we are seeing increasing amounts of Russian propaganda and information campaigns being conducted across the West, across just about every demographic. Whenever there is a crack, a disagreement, or a fissure in our society, Russia is monitoring and Russia is ready to step in and try and amplify divides and amplify conflict. And so I'll give you an example from Canada. Some of you might remember the Freedom Convoy, that trucker convoy, all those folks during COVID who were supposedly ordinary working class guys who, pretty conservative in nature, who went to Ottawa, parked their, big, massive 20-ton trucks or whatever it is in downtown Ottawa, occupied downtown Ottawa for a whole month and caused a whole load of trouble because they opposed lockdown, they opposed vaccines. Okay, fine. That's a domestic political issue. But Russia, even as that was happening, was in there amplifying that, making it worse, providing funding, providing material, and this is the important bit, drawing people over to Telegram as a space to discuss. Because Facebook, much easier for the West to control. Telegram, based outside of the West, basically nothing the West can do. That was at the beginning of 2022, January. When the war started in Ukraine, those Telegram groups that hosted the Freedom Convoy truckers suddenly started posting anti-Ukraine, pro-Russian content. And today they are posting content about we're all war fatigued, Zelensky is corrupt, he's stealing money, there's no point in any of this, Ukraine is just populated by far-right fascists anyway. Why should we in the West be bothering to support any of this when we have homelessness, we have rising costs of living? You know these lines. And we know that the people in those groups believe it. And what we see from those groups, from the convoy group, for example, is not just divisions in society as they disagree with other people around them, but also violence. We've seen people in similar far-right groups and indeed far-left groups who've committed acts of real violence, i.e. Russia, through these groups, through a lot of different steps, ultimately manages to weaponize Western citizens and has committing violence, causing chaos, changing our politics, shifting the norms of political discourse. And if it all sounds quite mad, and if it all sounds like, well, how could that possibly be effective? The answer is, it is effective because it's done at a huge scale. And I don't know the numbers, but 9 out of 10 of these groups will fail, right? They won't work. But you've only got to have a handful working to create quite a big effect.
The size of this infiltration was also observed in Germany. For example, when we had to get to know about Wirecard's case, where the very influential person, the guy who is originally from Czech Republic, he was involved in the creation of the payment method that comparable to PayPal or the payment gates, which has been used by the German people, and it turned out to be the Russian infiltrated project. The guy, the chief officer of the Wirecard just escaped Germany. He's probably in Russia right now, and that was a huge scandal in Germany when they uncovered that this guy and the people using this payment gate may be involved into financing of the Russian war machine. So this is not only about the information sites, about the influence in the social media, as you said, and this huge web of the Russian influencers, but it's also about the huge money, as we see.
Yeah, absolutely. You're 100% correct. That this is, when we think of hybrid warfare, this is full spectrum. It's not just about information. It is financial campaigns. It is manipulating flows of money in and out. It is finding agents in the European Parliament and in various NGOs. It is situating agents in universities as not just academics, but also students. And sometimes the stuff seems so low level, it's almost comical. So, for example, in England, either last year or 2 years ago, there was a sort of sleeper cell of Bulgarian citizens who were uncovered as Russian agents. And like, the guy was a taxi driver or something ridiculous, not really doing anything, not capable of doing much, but just there. And you have to consider how many more people does Russia have stationed around the West, right? And again, it's a numbers game. 1 in 100 people actually achieves anything. That's a good result for Russia.
But for many people, this Russian propaganda may seem attractive. You know, like people are trying to find something stable in this fluid world that we have today. They also perceive Russia as the source of the order on the east, as a country that is focused on how to maintain the family, how to maintain the public order, how to maintain the faith also. But when we take a look at the statistics, it's not that colorful, in the Russia, because you just can observe the growing number of divorces. We see the growing number of abortions, for example, of the addictions with the alcohol, for example, the people who are addicted to drugs, and they are not that religious as they seem. So how do Russia maintain this image of this Christian, peaceful country that is being attacked all over again, but the whole Western world, and they just try to protect the values? Even the American president, Donald Trump, was, full of kind words for a Russian president when it comes to his methods.
Absolutely. Again, you're correct that it is about stability in what seems like a time of chaos. And we know that as our worlds become increasingly online rather than offline, and often it's hard to tell the difference between what's virtual and what's real anymore, that chaos only increases, because social media is a vehicle that is designed to produce fragmentation. And Russia recognizes this and creates this image of itself that offers simple answers to complex problems. That's really at the heart of that image. You've got a homelessness problem, you've got a drug problem. Well, let's show you a sort of virtual Potemkin village version of what Russia is, in which, thanks to a strong leader, all of the problems are resolved, and we can go back to a nostalgic utopian past. And that's an incredibly effective tool, because we know in the West, lots of people are nostalgic for the past. In America, Republicans who support Trump want to go back to the 1950s, a time when they think they were safer, that people lived better, that people were happier. The research suggests that's not true. People were poorer, lifespans were shorter, all sorts of horrible diseases. Racism was a terrible problem. You go back to 1950s America, you're talking about racial segregation, right? You're talking about lynchings of Black people. But it's not a happy and cohesive society by any means. But Russia says, well, the past was cohesive in a way that the present can't be. And of course, this is an impossible promise. The present can never be so unnuanced, so perfect as promised. But the state knows how to brand itself. And it was really Vladislav Surkov, who's sometimes called Putin's grey cardinal of PR, who came up with the idea of using modern branding, modern marketing techniques, using modern entertainment shows, and ultimately social media to create the impression of this reality that is glittering and alluring and simplistic, rather than something complex and nuanced.
Mhm. But we sometimes just lose the track of the real Russian influence agents in the West, because it started to be treated as a conviction to many, many people who just are different, who have different opinions than the mainstream in the West, and they are being called like a Russian agents. So sometimes it's not being treated seriously at the moment, when we are all surrounded by only the Russian agents in the West, and just people started to convicting themselves and each other to be the Russian agents. And do you think that it's dangerous for us to just not to recognize the real ones, the people who really have an interest in spreading this Russian propaganda, because we started just tagging people in the West by being the Russian agent, and that's enough to exclude him, or to just close the discussion with the people?
Yeah, I'm really uncomfortable with a trend that I've seen that you're describing to describe almost anybody who voices anything that might have come from Russian propaganda as being a Russian agent. Because it excludes people in the way you've described. It polarizes opinion. It makes it much harder to actually figure out who really is a Russian agent, of which there must be some out there. We know that there are some out there. But it also doesn't recognize how Russian propaganda and information really works. Because it can turn all of us into useful idiots in a way that just wasn't true in, for example, the Soviet era. Because think about how I've already described propaganda operates within Russia, i.e. the state blasts these messages out, we don't pick up all of it, average Russians pick up bits and pieces and then spread them. Well, that is the same effect going on in the West, right? Russia is using the same strategy. And so inevitably, from time to time, everybody is going to spread Russian disinformation. I know, for example, on Twitter, on at least one or two occasions, I've accidentally shared a post that turned out not to be true. And those are the ones that I know were not true, that I realized later were not true. So I must have probably done it on more occasions when I didn't even realize it. And look, I don't want to blow my own trumpet and boast, but I think about this all the time and I'm on the lookout for this. So if I can be turned into a useful idiot, then I promise you can too.
So it only shows how vulnerable we are to the disinformation in the era of a social media event, because maybe at the first glance something may look as a valid point and something that we should share to just share the knowledge with it, but it turns out to be not totally true, and we just need to sometimes apologize for our words, sometimes remove some posts, but it's really important, in my opinion, to know the methods on how to protect ourselves from this disinformation methods. How to do it? Do you know any means on how to identify how to probe this Russian disinformation campaigns that are conducted in the social media? Are there any significant indicators that prove that that's not something that comes from the valid source?
Of course, there are some obvious ones. If we can't, for example, find a news story repeated by a major news organization like the BBC or CNN, The Guardian, some other reliable source, then I'd be dubious about whether a fact or a claim is true. But the problem is social media usually doesn't give us the time to check those things because it's always firing things at us very, very fast. Whereas the BBC will take a day or 2 days to publish a story because they actually do fact-checking and research on the story, and by then it's already too late. And so the answer for me is to take the responsibility away from ordinary users, because we just can't be expected or trusted to pass through and do research on every single post we read and everything we share or like. Instead, it is time for Western governments to get real and spend less time uncovering influence operations after they've appeared on social media networks and more time interrogating Facebook, X,
YouTube as well.
Thank you. YouTube. For some reason, I've forgotten all of the social media networks for a second there. But YouTube's a good example. Interrogating the owners of those companies and saying, what can we do to stop Russian disinformation actually appearing on the networks in the first place? What can we do to stop that information then being amplified by bots and trolls? And if social media companies don't want to cooperate, then Western governments, and this will be hard to do politically because it will be seen as a freedom of speech issue, but it's not, and I'll explain why in a second. If social media companies don't cooperate, Western governments have to say, this is a part of national defense. This is a response to what Russia believes is a war, and therefore you have to do it. And if you don't do it, we will force you, we will jail you, we will fine you. And this is not a freedom of speech issue, because enemy combatants do not have the right to come into our discursive spaces and voice their opinions and spread their propaganda. We have a right as Western citizens to say anything we want. So if I choose to go to a Russian newspaper, a Russian propaganda source, pick out information and spread it online as a Western citizen, that's okay. That's freedom of speech. No problem with that. I mean, of course, there are other problems, but, you know, we just have to permit this. But the idea that Russia should be allowed, that Dmitry Medvedev should be allowed on Twitter to spread disinformation, that Alexander Dugin should be allowed to host Twitter spaces, that Russia Today should be able to share clips on YouTube. No, that's just absurd.
Mm-hmm. But what about the young people in Russia? You just devoted your book, The Z Generation, to the mindsets of the young Russians and how do they perceive the whole ruling group, the ruling processes that are taking place in Russia. And it's also about them, but because they are mobilized to join the army. They are being fed by the propaganda. They use the social media where they encounter a lot of fake news, you know, about the world, about what Russia does in the world, about what happened in a Moscow recently, even. So what about the young Russians who use the social media? They theoretically uh, possibility to compare the information, to use different sources of the information, because it seems as we have in Russia like two types of a people, like young people from the big cities who decided to leave, for example, to leave Russia after the invasion on the Ukraine, because they described it as they don't want to live in such country that is being banned in almost in the half of the world, and they cannot travel, they cannot make use of those Western, you know, any Western types of life. They cannot just continue it. But they are also the other Russian people. So do we have any image of the Russian young man who is infected, you know, by this Russian propaganda, and they in fact do not have the choice when they pick up any information, because as you said, they are surrounded by this propaganda in the social media as well. So is this a way for the Russian propaganda apparatus to raise those people as the people who are going to just to treat the Russian information, Russian government linked information as without any doubts? So those young people are in the army right now?
I know, thanks to working on this book, for which I spoke to a lot of young Russians, and I tell their stories in the book, and I show how they've got wrapped up in this world of propaganda and militarism. We know that in every age demographic, including the youngest Russians, people are supportive of the war. People are broadly supportive of Putin. There was just a major survey released by an institute in Chicago that polled over 1,000 young Russians that suggested that almost all of them were patriotic. Almost all of them shared their parents' values. We've seen a mass exodus of people who might have represented an opposition, and that's mostly millennials at the start of the war in particular. And now the state is pouring huge amounts of money into propagandizing youth in an extreme version of militarism, an extreme version of nationalism. And I show in the book how young children are buying into it, and young children trapped in this information environment may simply not be able to conceive of another world, even with access to the internet.
So we highly recommend to grab a book by Ianem Garner. We luckily have a chance to do it in a Polish version by wydawnictwo Prześwity. It's a book called Za Putina and Z Generation in the original language version. Thank you very much for today. Thank you for your visit on my channel, Mr. Garner. That was a pleasure to meet you. It was a pleasure to ask you some questions and get to know more about how those Russian machine, war machine, information machine works. Thank you very much for your time, for sharing your knowledge today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and wish you all the best with the further investigations on Russian minds. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.